Okay, hello internets. Today in psychology we're going to look at personality, Freud, and the psychodynamic theory. So this is part of Unit 1 for us, and we're looking at personality. It is psychodynamic theory, and Freud is pretty controversial. You'll hear some things and you'll think, what is he talking about? And all I can tell you is that it's kind of worth the ride with Freud. I don't know that there's much that I really believe he nailed right on the money, and it's very hard to empirically prove a lot of the things that he said. But in the end, I think his contributions are certainly pretty large to psychology and to the understanding of the human mind. And we'll get more into that here and explain it some as we go. So what do you need to know after you're done with this? I'd list and describe the three components into which Freud divides the personality. So this is the personality chapter. That's really the focus. And indicate how these are distributed across the three levels of awareness. That's really his big breakthrough. Explain the role of internal conflicts in Freud's theory and how that then plays itself out in his theory with defense mechanisms. And some of those make a lot of common sense. Outline Freud's psychosexual stages of development and their theorized relations to adult personality. So that's the last part of his ideas here, and for some people they kind of see some truth in that, but for others they think it's kind of off the wall and maybe a little bit crazy. So Sigmund Freud came up with this idea of psychodynamic theory, and B.F. Skinner, he had this grand idea called behaviorism. Both of these are massive overarching plans and theories that try to deal with all of humanity and all of our problems and try to answer it in a way to say this is the answer. Most of what we're going to study in psychology isn't like that. They're little individual things that we'll be able to test and were tested, and maybe somebody else built upon it, and then we had a new, more scientifically based and grounded theory. Now, I'm not saying that Skinner isn't scientifically based, because he is probably the most with behaviorism. In many ways, it's all about experiments, and there's the root of his theory is in the experimental model. But with Freud, this overarching idea and this big picture model can be confusing, because there is maybe some truth into some of the things he's talking about, but the overarching theory is pretty hard to put into place. If you ask somebody today, who do you know that's a psychologist, they're probably going to mention Sigmund Freud. Maybe Dr. Phil or somebody from television, but they're going to mention Sigmund Freud for sure. He was very famous for his time and extremely well known today. And he was up for the Nobel Prize, and Albert Einstein famously sort of wrote a letter and said to the Nobel folks, he's only a psychologist. How can you give the prize to him? So Freud thinks of the mind as an iceberg. It floats with, he says, 1/7 of the bulk underwater. So we need to keep that in mind. That's his idea of the unconsciousness. So Freud leaves Europe to escape the Nazis in Germany. He is a Jew, and this is also part of the controversy with him, because the Jewish faith, it falls under controversy pretty constantly just because of the hatred and anti-Semitism in the world. So you have to kind of keep that in mind as well when you read about him. Anything internet based on Freud is really difficult. It can get carried away. There's a lot of salacious statements and those kinds of things. But Freud's kind of interesting, though. He says upon leaving Germany, he was asked to sign a letter saying that the Nazi Gestapo, the Hitler police squad, had never harmed him. And so he signs it, and then he writes kind of a little signing statement at the bottom. The Gestapo has never harmed me in any way. In fact, I can hardly recommend the Gestapo for everyone. So he had a biting cynicism and sort of a real serious look at the world, and pretty sarcastic in many ways. He was a person that was almost above the rest, and like to make sure that you knew that. He had some very controversial things that he thought up, and theories that he came up with, like penis envy and architectural phallic symbols like the Washington Monument, or I guess closer to home, the San Jacinto Monument. But however, we'll talk about some of those things as we go here, but however, the core set of claims has immense importance, and that's why we are going to talk about them today. Now, how much is going to be for the AP folks? How much is going to be on the AP test with Freud? A little bit, but it's not like a lot of students think when they come into psychology. It's Freud, 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 Freud. One of the reasons I moved up personality into this first unit is I wanted to focus on it a little bit more, because in my mind I was like, we don't have much time, so I'm not going to spend time on Freud when there's so little empirical proof, scientific proof, and also it's not going to be on the AP test as much. But the idea of the unconscious and unconscious motivations and those conflicts that happen deep in our minds and deep into what the brain is trying to resolve, those things are very important. So let's look through psychodynamic perspective first. Freud believed psychology influences caused disorders, and he wanted to see what these psychological influences were. So he creates this overarching theory, and he comes up with lots of ideas, but this is really the first personality theory ever invented. He explores the unconscious mind, and he thinks it's filled with, and this is the controversial part really, unacceptable thoughts, unacceptable wishes and feelings and memories, and things that you are repressing, that happen to you or that you have thoughts about and that you struggle with as a person. He used, and this is really important, so you should definitely know this, that free association is his technique to get into the unconscious mind. Initially, he tries his hand at hypnotism, and we'll discuss that some, especially when we're talking about the consciousness. So he thought, by hypnotizing his patients, he'd be able to get into the deep recesses of their unconsciousness and pull that information out. And he didn't have much success with that. I'm sure he had some fun with it because he was Freud and it's crazy. And you can hypnotize somebody, maybe not like you see in the movies, but you can hypnotize someone if you put the power of suggestion into them and kind of convince them to come along with you for the ride. Getting into the unconsciousness in that way was through hypnotism he didn't see as much success with. So he then comes up with this idea called free association, and we'll do some of this in class, but he'll throw a word out there like sky or grass or house or mother or whatever, and when he do that, the patient would just give him the very first thing that came to their mind. And with psychoanalysis and the treatment of people, the psychodynamic theory, the couch at the bottom of the screen there, right here, this is actually Freud's couch, and his chair where he sits is over here, the green chair. Okay, so he would sit with his back, or with the patient's back. So the patient's sitting this way, and Freud would be sitting on the other side. They don't see each other eye to eye. It's not the client-centered kind of therapy we'll talk about later on in the semester. But what the idea is that you're helping the person kind of get to the bottom of what their issues are. And once they're retrieved and they're let out and they're released through this version of talk therapy, through these discussions, the patient would feel better just in getting that out of them. So here's a picture of Hermann Rorschach, and the reason I show you this here, and this is Freudian Technique, and he was a Freudian follower, is that if you looked at these images, and they're just ink blots, right, and many of them just ink smeared on one side, and then you fold the paper and fold it back out, and you've got this image that's kind of symmetrical, but it's just a mess. And what you do here is try to get someone to tell you what they're thinking when they see it. You don't see anything, but maybe something will slip out and they'll start to discuss the problems that they're hiding. We'll see this clip, probably see this clip in class on Tuesday, and this is the psychoanalysis. I say Tuesday, but right before we're finished with personality. But the psychoanalysis of Sheldon from The Big Bang. And I'm not crazy, my mother had me tested. He has some issues, but it's a pretty funny little clip, and it gets kind of the bottom, at least in a funny way, of showing what psychoanalysis is all about. So here's the iceberg. Okay, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Well, the tip of the iceberg is up here, right? It's what you can see, and unfortunately for the Titanic, there was more that they couldn't see. Freud says it's like an iceberg. The analogy is that the mind is like that. So the conscious, what you are currently aware of, is part of this. The preconscious is the information not conscious, but we're able to retrieve it pretty easily. And the unconscious is this massive amount, I think he said 70% or so, this massive amount that's underneath the surface that you can't get to and you can't see and you certainly don't even know is there. So where are these three things at? There's your conscious, of course, that's above the water. You can see it and you're aware of it. The preconscious just below the surface, where you can probably pull it up if you need to. In a way, an iceberg is kind of floating like this, so it would rise above the surface some. The unconscious is not going to ever come up to the surface, I guess, unless the Titanic hits you or you hit it. If you're the iceberg, I don't know. This is an iceberg lettuce. That's a whole different thing. So another way to look at it too is we'll talk about the id, the ego, and the superego later. And here is another analogy, putting those terms in there as well. So what is in your unconscious area? Well, this is one we'll talk about when we just discuss consciousness as a chapter, and we look at dreams and dream theory. His dream theory is almost entirely built on wish fulfillment. But he believes that you're going to dream about things that you really want to do, or fears that you have because of the things that you do want to do. We'll discuss that a little bit more later on, but the latent content of dreams is the symbolic meaning of dreams. So what your unconscious mind is thinking, so there's manifest and latent. And he was trying to get to the point where if they did some dream analysis, the patient would tell them about a dream they've had, and then they would go through this discussion trying to pinpoint, what is this dream about? What is your unconscious really trying to tell you? So, slip of the tongue is a whole different thing. Slip of the tongue works like this. When you're trying to say something and you're talking, and something slips out, a word that's very similar to another word that you're trying to say, and maybe that word is filled with some kinds of like uncomfortable thoughts, or it sounds very similar, but you say a word you shouldn't say. What Freud is saying is there are no accidents. I mean, it's coming out because of the need for it to be retrieved and brought to the surface, and you are struggling with it. There's maybe some truth to this, but I don't know. I mean, there's Jerry Willis, I think that's her name at the bottom. She's on Fox now. She had been doing a business report on, I believe the topic was theme parks, and she mentions Schlitterbahn, but she doesn't exactly say Schlitterbahn. At the beginning, there's a little four-letter word that she kind of inserts in there, and she does it a number of times. And Freud would say that maybe she has some issues there. I have no idea what that would mean, but some people do this and they'll say, this must be a Freudian slip. We see Freudian slips kind of made fun of quite a lot. I guess that's Freud in a slip there at the bottom. This test will show you what kind of personality you have. Is the glass half empty or half full? And the person says, if you look closely, it's more like 2/5 empty and 3/5 full, because that's Prometheus. So what kind of personality do I have? Annoying. A Freudian slip is when you say one thing, but mean your mother. I mean another. And I've also seen that cartoon done this way. A Freudian slip is when you say one thing, but mean a mother. So, and not another, but a mother is put in there. So this is the idea that Freud had a lot of like childhood issues and trauma that you may have experienced, and some of it's not even trauma, it's just stages you have to work through. And if you kind of get stuck in some of those stages, or you have issues or problems there, they can kind of linger in your unconscious, and that can bring about problems later on. So let's look at personality development. The pleasure principle is pure id. That's where that comes from. Freud believed that the id was basic and fundamental, foundational. It's present at birth. It's the animal inside of you. The id is entirely stupid, which all of these things kind of are. these ideas. It's just like a pure impulse, and it wants it now. It wants to eat. It wants the dessert before the dinner. And it's polymorphous perversity, the pure desire for pleasure, and it's very unconscious, but it's there. However, what you want isn't always available. So humans develop ways to deal with the id, because you can't always say, I want dessert, I want dessert, I want dessert, or I want to have a relationship with this person, that person, this person, that person. So, but either planning how to get what you want constructively, or suppressing those needs until you can fulfill them, is the struggle here. The conscious is the ego or the self. So if you have a big ego, I guess you have a big self. That's what people were trying to say when they say you have a big ego. The reality principle is based upon this: how to make your way in the world, how to satisfy your pleasures, or how to give them up entirely. So that's a whole different thing, isn't it? If you're going away from the id and I want it now. And the superego is where that comes in. It's the third component. And it says that you internalize the rules of society and of your parents. And it is also terribly stupid. You know, it's not based upon like functional reality of saying this is what I should do. Let's do this with a plan. It's saying stop. Don't do that. You are disgusting. You should be ashamed of yourself. How dare you think in these ways? And the ego is in between. So in many ways, it's kind of like the two, the angel and the devil on your shoulders, trying to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. The self decides. So here's your personality structure. You got your id, the ego, and the superego. The angelic person is who? Superego. The person is the ego, and the devil, in this example, with Homer Simpson on the left, is the id. The id says, I want it now. The ego says, we need to do some planning here to be able to make sure we get this right. Maybe we can work together with other people. And the superego says, you can't have it. It's not right. In fact, you don't deserve it. You are such a bad person for thinking about this. I think we see these things pop out from our personalities at times, and it does affect our behavior. I know I have gotten pretty upset after losing football games. You know, we lose a game, and I'd have my parents and all these other people who came up to watch me play in college. It's 2 hours away from home, and I'd sit brooding in the locker room for 2 hours after the game, and everybody's waiting on me. I mean, that's the ego should have said, hey, listen, let's put this aside. Who's winning when I punish myself like that? Definitely the superego. And I think some people play out in these ways where you can see they're more id driven or superego driven. Now, is the theory correct? Is it perfect? It's hard to test this and hard to see it, but I think some of it makes some sense when you consider just human behavior and how personality works. So here you go. I guess this person might be a New Jersey Devil fan on one side and an Angels fan on the other side. Maybe he's trying to decide what to eat, or I'm sorry, what to watch on television. Those are rabbit ears. We used to have those before the days of cable and satellite and stuff, and just be glad you don't have to do that. It was terrible. So your superego, id, and ego. And the person at the bottom, she is looking at two choices there, isn't she? What's the angel saying? The angel is saying, sweetheart, you don't deserve that chocolate cake. You've been a very bad person. You have sinned in the past. What you need to do is have that fruit. And I'm not even sure if you deserve the fruit. It's too good for you. And the devil is saying, why don't you have that chocolate cake? In fact, why don't you eat both? Why don't you eat as much as you want? You deserve it. You never do anything fun. And the angel is saying, that is not true. You remember the last time. So the id, ego, and superego. And it's this idea. So I pulled this up. I was trying to find some characters from television or movies that you might be able to relate to. And I think these work pretty well from the Avengers. The id, I want it right now. I mean, is there anybody that typifies that better than Tony Stark? I mean, that's the scene up there at the top left-hand corner where he's eating the donut. You know, he's had kind of a rough night from what I remember, and he kind of sits up on top of this donut shop and he's eating a box of donuts. He wants it now. He's going to have it now. And Tony Stark, you know, the guy who is going to save the world, he's pretty flamboyant and he's pretty outgoing. In the middle there, the ego. Let's work together. It's teamwork. It's country that's important. That would be probably Captain America. Teamwork and country. On the right, and this might be, I don't know, I think it works pretty well, but good people don't worry about those things. So this is Thor, who was a good son to his father, who is a kind of a good figure to the human girlfriend. I just have to say Natalie Portman, because I kind of like Natalie. I'm like a Natalie Portman fan. I don't know. That's just the way I am. I also thought about the agent from the Avengers, and he's kind of that same really good, wholesome kind of dude. But these three, I think, work together pretty well. In fact, there's a really good scene where Iron Man and Thor are going to have this massive fight, and they're in a plane. I think they're going to Germany in the Avengers, and they descend fighting each other. And who goes down to break it up? Captain America, because we got to work together. So I think this analogy works pretty well. I don't know how you can remember id, ego, and superego, but you need to think of some ways because they're important. That's the kind of thing you might see on the AP test for sure for you AP guys. So how does it negotiate between the id and superego? There are clashes called intra-psychic or psychodynamic conflicts. That's kind of where the psychodynamic theory plays in here. The process can cause stress and anxiety. The ego in the center is going to try to prevent the anxiety and the guilt and the unpleasant feelings. But sometimes the ego helps us negotiate those situations well, and other times it doesn't. And so it doesn't really know how to deal with this. This is according to Freud's theory, and so we have developed defense mechanisms. Now, defense mechanisms are something that people kind of refer to in everyday life. And when you see these, you'll say, yeah, I've heard of these before, and I may do that, actually. So some of these make an awful lot of sense. There's your breakdown of your iceberg a little bit better. The ego, execute mediating between the id impulses and superego inhibitions. Testing reality, rationalism, and it's very rational. It operates mainly at the conscious level, but some at the preconscious, but there's no ego in the unconscious level. In this example, the superego is a little bit above the surface, but not much. It's closer. It's almost entirely in the preconscious. The ideas and morals, striving for perfection, incorporated from parents. So your parents are going to try to instill this maybe. Becoming a person's conscious. So this is that voice inside your head. But there's another voice inside your head that you may not know exists completely, because it's more, I think it's more silent than the preconscious level superego. The id is that desire that you don't even hear a voice, it just pushes you to do. It's the basic impulse, whether we're talking sex or aggression or immediate gratification or irrational and impulsive urges. We'll look at the marshmallow effect later in the year, where they put this marshmallow in front of these kids, and they tell them, if you wait, we're going to leave the room, but if we wait and you don't eat that marshmallow now, you'll get 2 when we come back. And it proves out over time that if someone is very good at suppressing these unconscious desires, that they will have a better, more successful life in their long-term future down the road. And that sounds crazy. It sounds nuts, but I think it's just the power of waiting and the power of, I'm going to give into those impulses, but not now. I'm going to wait until it's a better time. So anyway, we'll talk more about that with social psychology. Personality development. So Freud believed that the personality formed in the first few years of life, and he divided these into the psychosexual stages. There are a number of these. Sometimes people just go with the 3, the oral, anal, and phallic. I'm adding the latency and genital in there as well, because those are, I think they're important. But I've seen it some ways, they just say there's just 3 of them. And on Psych Trek, that might be the case. If you know the first 3, you'll be good. But I think you should know the other 2 as well. So the id is that devil, and it's talking about pleasure-seeking energies, focusing on pleasure-sensitive body areas. So these are parts of the body called erogenous zones. And that's what Freud's focusing on here, is this is a psychosexual stage. And I've got a kid next door that comes over to visit my kid all the time, and he is driving me crazy with this little ringing of the doorbell. So if he doesn't stop, I'll pause this and make a part 2. But let's look at Freud's psychosexual stage. Maybe he has some issues with this. I don't know. I'm just joking. The oral stage. From 0 to 1 years old, you'd obtain pleasure from the mouth via sucking, biting, and swallowing. I'll cut a second one of these, and so we'll get that. I want to make sure he doesn't keep ringing. He will ring the doorbell for the entire time I sit here. So I'll make a part 2 of this. We'll start here with Freud's psychosexual stages in part 2 of Freud and Psychodynamic